The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning. Before we get started with the stakeholder meeting, we just want to make sure that everybody that's on the webinar can hear us. So if you can please raise your hand, that's a good indicator that you can hear my voice. Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right, well, welcome and thank you for attending the joint stakeholder meeting for the Board of Chiropractic Examiners, the State Board of Optometry, Colorado Podiatry Board, State Physical Therapy Board, State Board of Veterinarian Medicine, and State Board of Veterinary Medicine, via webinar today. Before we get started, we would like to introduce the staff members from the Division of Professions and Occupations that are present. My name is Elena Kemp, and I am a regulatory coordinator with the division. Also attending is Karen McGovern. She's the Deputy Division Director, Legal Affairs. Karen Phelan, she's the Program Director of Optometry, Podiatry, and Veterinarian Medicine. And Cheris Fraley, she's the Program Director for Chiropractic Examiners and Physical Therapy. And we also have Laura Bravo, she's a Policy Analyst with the division, and we will be facilitating this stakeholder meeting. In compliance with the Governor's order regarding COVID-19, the division has transitioned into a platform that is 100% virtual, and we appreciate your flexibility. As many of you have been to DORA stakeholder meetings before, we would like to reiterate the importance of your comments today. DORA makes decisions every day that may affect your life and your business. Your input is vital in the rulemaking process. Throughout this process, our goal is to create regulations that clarify and explain legislation, ensure minimum competency to enter and continue to practice, and provide only what is absolutely necessary for consumer protection without creating unnecessary barriers to the marketplace. Your input will be part of the information that goes to the boards to consider permanently adopting the emergency licensing rules related to COVID-19. More specifically, we'll be talking about Rule 1.31 for chiropractic examiners, Rule 1.27 for optometry, Rule 105 for podiatry, Rule 1.4 for physical therapy, and Rule 1.23 for veterinarian medicine. This meeting is being recorded and will be posted on the website at a later date. As this stakeholder meeting is held solely via webinar, please raise your hand by using the hand icon if you would like to speak, and we will unmute your line so you can be heard by everyone. Or you can type in a comment in the question section and we will read it aloud. Before we start taking comments, I want to ask that everyone providing comments to please state your name and who you represent, if anybody. Feel free to provide either general comments on the rule changes or specific comments on the proposed language. Please try to keep your comments limited to 3 to 5 minutes or less, and try not to repeat something that was already said. Stating that you're in full agreement with someone else works just fine, and we will note it. If you are using audio through your computer, please remember to put your phones on vibrate or turn them off. And whether or not you're using computer or phone audio, please try to keep background noises to a minimum when speaking. So I'm not sure if Karen, if you wanted to comment on a couple of things just to open the discussion, we can do that now. Otherwise, we could start taking comments.
Hi, this is Karen McGovern. I just wanted to thank everyone for coming. I think maybe the best way to handle this joint stakeholder meeting is maybe to work through professions and take all the comments for the chiropractor rules and then move on to the next profession. So we appreciate your patience with that.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so the rules that we have showing on the screen are the emergency licensing rules for the Chiropractic Examiners Board. Feel free to raise your hand or type in a comment, and we'll be glad to unmute your line or read it aloud. It looks like we have one hand raised.
Yeah, I'll unmute her. Rachel Went, your hand is, you're unmuted. You're in there twice. Hold on just a second. Not sure which one to unmute for you. There you go. You're unmuted again. Rachel, would you like to make comment? Rachel, you're on the line on two different phone lines, it looks like. It looks like one's unmuted, one's not. Are you able to speak? You hung up one of your lines. See if we can unmute the other one for you. Her hand's lowered again, so we'll move on.
Maybe we should provide just a little context about where we are in this process. So the rules that are currently on the screen, they have already been adopted as emergency rules, as many of you already know. At this point, the board is trying to decide whether or not these rules should be made permanent. So any feedback that you may have, whether you are in support or you do not support these changes, that would be helpful for the board to consider. They're just kind of testing, just trying to get public feedback to see where everybody's at with these rules. Do you think they're necessary? Do you like them? Do you want to change a portion of these rules? Any feedback would be helpful. So I don't see any hands raised or questions about chiropractic examiners. So we'll move on. So if anybody would like to speak on the temporary licensing rules for optometry, this is now your time. Looks like we've got a hand raised. Miss Cheryl Benjamin, your line is now unmuted.
Yes, this is Cheryl Benjamin with the Colorado Optometric Association, and we are fine with the temporary rules. Your comment just now that these might be made permanent does concern us. We were not under the had no understanding that that was indeed being considered as a permanent rule for temporary licensure, since there are dates in these like through December 31st, 2020 and so forth. So I would want to discuss this further with our membership to see what their feeling is on that and how you would change the dates therefore to make that an effective permanent rule. So I do have concerns in making that a permanent rule.
So this is Karen Montgomery. I think understanding sort of how the rules, the emergency versus permanent rulemaking works might be beneficial. So temporary rules are only in effect for 120 days. And as we move through the pandemic, we don't know that 120 days will be enough. You know, looking at the news recently, it looks like the numbers are again climbing. We're still having issues with testing centers and, you know, them not opening to full capacity. And then now that they are open, looking at perhaps providing more social distancing, which would mean even fewer candidates would be able to sit for an examination. It wouldn't be something that's permanent, meaning forever. Permanent rules are different than emergency rules in that they take effect until they're repealed. So I don't want to get sort of caught up in the, we want to make this permanent because this is going to be in place forever, meaning that we have to do something because these rules will expire in August and then we will have, we won't have any option to keep extending this if people aren't able to take their examinations. Does that make sense?
Yes, that does, and that's helpful to understand that perspective. So with that in mind, I do think that that does make some sense, for sure.
Okay. And I think it's you know, we're in this sort of novel space right now, and so we're trying to comply with the law, you know, making sure that we honor that emergency rules are only good for 120 days, but also trying to keep something in place that can stay in place until the emergency declaration and the pandemic have sort of subsided. We're going to keep them all in the same rule, which means at the point when this is no longer an issue, the board can quickly go in and repeal the rule in one fell swoop.
Okay, thank you.
Looks like we have a question from a Miss, I can't see your name, I apologize. Rachel Went. The question is, when the boards repeal, do they have to go through the entire stakeholder process again? In short, yes. Every time we open up for rulemaking, whether we are implementing legislation or just simply cleaning up the rules and making changes to the rules or repealing rules, we do open the rules up for public comment. And then the boards consider that before their permanent rulemaking hearing. Okay, once again, these are the permanent or temporary licensure rules for optometry. I don't see any other hands raised, so we are going to continue to the next board. So if you have any comments for the Podiatry Board, this is your time to speak. We'll go through the rules. And once again, please raise your hand or type in a comment, and we'll read it aloud.
I don't see any other hands raised at this time. We have another chiropractic question, although we're on optometry. Would you like me to read that?
Yes.
Okay. How can chiropractors help lower hospitalization rates if we are considered essential practitioners but can't see patients unless they are extremely acute? That's a pretty broad question. I don't know that that's specific to what we're addressing right now. If we're going to work on extending those rules, I'm happy to take your information down and we can take that question offline. If you want to send me a private chat with your email or phone call, but
Looks like we've got a hand raised from Louisa Long. Your line is unmuted. Oh, it looks like you're self-muted.
Hi, my name is Louisa Long. I'm a physical therapist, and mine is pertaining specifically to physical therapy. Should I wait until then?
I do believe, since we don't have, it doesn't look like we have any other hands raised or comments about podiatry. I do believe that is the next board that we're talking about. You can move.
Okay, I can wait if that's more appropriate.
Nope, you're fine. Here we are.
All right, thank you. So my concern with, I understand the purpose of extending the services and everything due to the pandemic. My concern is that there's many of my constituents who are out of work because of the pandemic. And if licensing is going to be extended temporarily to those new grads or those who have pending licenses and such, that's just going to lessen the options for the job market for those of us who are all out of work anyways.
Mm.
I guess that's not really a question, it's more of a concern.
No, and it's definitely going to be noted. The boards will be able to listen and hear this webinar recording later. So, yeah, any types of feedback you have is helpful.
I know that the market to find consistent full-time salaried work, at least in my industry, was tight and competitive beforehand. And now with this, it's made significantly worse for us.
I see. Okay.
Thank you for your comment. We'll make note of that.
Thank you. I'm actually having to change careers completely, like just get out of physical therapy completely personally, because I don't expect to be able to find a full-time job anytime soon.
Well, thank you for your comment. Sorry.
Thank you. I'll go ahead and mute myself again.
Okay. We have another hand raised from a Crystalline Lowry. You are unmuted. Looks like you're self-muted.
Perfect. Looks like I'm unmuted. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Beautiful. My name is Dr. Crystalline Lowry. I actually hold my doctorate in chiropractic, but I'm also board certified in physiotherapy, and we have physical therapists that work in my practice. And I would also like to voice concerns about the permanent adoption of emergency protocols. I understand this is a very difficult time for all of us on this call, you guys included, trying to understand how to keep people at their best and their safest. Is there no opportunity to extend emergency ruling, considering that this is an extension of what we had hoped would be a shorter-lived pandemic and emergency situation, instead of permanently adopting a set of rulings that will then have to be revised and overturned later? Earlier in the call, I believe the quote was, "You can turn it over in one fell swoop," at their discretion, though. So we will have to wait for the discretion of the board to decide that it is time, the emergency has ended, then have another stakeholders meeting to reverse them. Is there no opportunity to meet this adversity with an extension of emergency rules that is not permanent?
This is Karen McGovern, the Deputy Division Director. There's not an option, because emergency rules by law are in effect for 120 days. And
I understand.
I think that there is, I think that there's this confusion about the permanent rules. The rules will stay in place
Until they're overturned.
Well, they'll be made permanent, meaning that they will no longer be temporary rules. But I think that the issue is that as soon as the pandemic ends, or as soon as we recognize that the testing centers are open and there's no more backlog and new graduates getting tested, then we will be able to repeal the rule.
That would be 100% at the state and the board's discretion, though, without any input from stakeholders on when that should be repealed, correct?
Well, the board, again, when the board thought that it was time, the board could hold a stakeholder meeting, but we take stakeholder feedback all year. And so if somebody believed that it was, that the testing centers were up to speed, they could certainly contact the board and ask for the board to revisit the rule.
Okay. I just wanted to voice concerns because you had said thank you for the input. So I'd like to let it be known that our chiropractors and our physical therapists are also unfortunately saying, ooh, and I think it is the word permanent in there, because that has a colloquial term that is associated with it that says this is long lasting. And so perhaps it's in the vernacular, but I believe that a permanent change is something we should at least hold space to consider, as we are this morning, that it may or may not be in the best interest of our professions going forward, as we hope the pandemic ends.
Sure, and I think the concern is that there's an executive order, requiring that that the healthcare fields be opened up and have as many available healthcare workforce as possible. And so the board has a requirement to comply with that executive order. And at the time that the executive order ends or the state of emergency ends, then the board would no longer have the authority to have these rules, which is why, while they're called permanent, they can only stay in effect so long as the emergency declaration and executive order stay in effect.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to voice my opinion, so I appreciate your feedback and consideration.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any more hands raised or any questions about physical therapy. So I will move on to the next board, which I believe is Veterinarian Medicine. Yes.
Diane Matt, you're unmuted.
Good morning. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Great. Thank you. My name is Diane Matt, and I am the CEO of the Colorado Veterinary Medical Association. And I have a few questions and a few comments. First, I would like to say thank you for holding this meeting. It's very helpful. The Colorado Veterinary Medical Association represents 1,800 licensed Colorado veterinarians and another 800 veterinary professionals. I wanted to start by saying that, or asking, can you please give me a citation for the rules that surround making emergency rules and temporary rules, because I have learned a lot this morning in this call, and I am not confident that I really understand all of the provisions of what temporary means and what permanent means and what emergency means. So if you could offer a citation about that at some point, that would be helpful so that I can do a little more work on that. I'm imagining that Karen McGovern will make that, but if you need a few minutes, I can go on with my comments.
Hi, this is Karen. You can look at 24-4103 in the APA, the Administrative Procedure Act, and that discusses the rulemaking process, including emergency rules.
Okay, that's great. 24-4103. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Okay, that's great. To continue then, some of these comments may be sort of predicated on a different understanding that I now have in mind. But to start, the CVMA Board of Directors has understood that the primary benefit of having a permanent rule, which we didn't understand might be conditioned by how long the pandemic lasts. Anyway, that would permit the Colorado State Board of Veterinary Medicine to grant temporary licenses to practice veterinary medicine to newly graduated students, and that the primary benefit would be that it would facilitate a fast governmental response to activating medical professions in emergency situations. So we were kind of understanding this as something that might be applied to other states of emergency that might happen in the future. So the general position of CVMA under that circumstance is that we can appreciate the wisdom of considering the idea of having something in place that would grant authority to the board to essentially expand the veterinary workforce in emergency situations. I'm now understanding that that may not be what you're asking at all, but I'll do some more homework. And I have the impression there will be another stakeholder engagement on this topic. Don't really know that. So another comment is that the temporary license, which in our case is Rule 1.23, allows newly graduated veterinarians to be temporarily licensed to practice under the direction of a licensed veterinarian. That provision is actually quite similar to statutes and rules that allow veterinary students. Excuse me, I'm getting some feedback. Thank you. Anyway, we see that as being very similar to statutes and rules that allow veterinary students to work under direct supervision by a licensed veterinarian. So in some ways it doesn't make much sense to not allow new graduates to do something similar in an emergency situation. So we see a parallel there. We can actually foresee various situations in which temporary licensing could benefit society, and among them are things like pandemics and epidemics like COVID-19 that just mainly affect people and needing to expand the workforce. We can also see pandemics or epidemics that might affect animals or both animals and people, and it would be even more important under those situations to be able to expand the veterinary workforce. We can see situations where natural disasters could happen, and those can often affect animals even more than they affect people. If animals are trapped in wildfires or floods, then the importance of having a robust veterinary workforce becomes really important. And we can imagine that those kinds of emergencies could be local, they could be regional, they could be national, they could even be global. So we can see all of those situations. We also have concerns about the potential for misuse of the temporary license rule. And see that it could be used to excuse delays in processing of new licenses, or we could see that it could be misused by people who were hoping to be licensed from out of state if the guidelines for this weren't really concrete and clear about what it was intended to do and for whom. So we have that concern. We also note that the existing rule is written very specifically for the COVID-19 executive order. And if we're just looking to extend that order longer, then that's appropriate. If we're looking to establish some kind of a rule that would allow for greater flexibility in future pandemics or epidemics or natural disasters, then of course this would have to be rewritten. So far, I have not seen or don't know where to find a revision to this rule to be able to really comment thoughtfully about what the new rule might say. So to close, I'll say that we appreciate the opportunity to provide some comments as we understand the situation right now. We are looking forward to making comments on a proposed final rule if that's the decision made. And I would appreciate any information you can give me about what the next steps in this process are. And that's what I wanted to comment, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you.
So we do appreciate all the comments that we've received thus far. I was just wanting to double back on with a comment that Ms. Diane Matt just said. We don't have any questions for you because the board doesn't have any questions. So during the stakeholder meeting, we're just trying to get the feedback from stakeholders, but the board, we don't really have any questions. The board is trying to see whether these rules should be made permanent or not. So we do appreciate your comments. And as far as the next steps, we will definitely go through that in a little bit more detail when we wrap up this meeting. And I don't see that we have any more hands raised, so that might be sooner than later. Once again, if you guys want to comment, please raise your hand. And since we've already gone through all of the boards, because we're at the end now, we could go back and talk about chiropractic examiners, temporary licensure rules. If somebody came into the meeting late and would like to address one of the rules that were already presented on the screen, we can do that. We just want to make sure we do capture all comments that you may have.
We have a comment from David Lamson. He says, please, please, please do not make these rules permanent.
Okay, thank you. And what board is Mr. Lamson?
He's with the he's providing comment for the chiropractors.
Okay. Now we're looking at physical therapy once again. I think we can give it just a few more minutes, just in case stakeholders are in mid-type or mid-thought, trying to formulate their thoughts to provide comments. We'll wait. Right now the time is 9:38. We'll wait until about 9:40 to take any last-minute comments, and then we'll continue with the stakeholder meeting, or continue to close the stakeholder meeting. Miss Diane Matt, looks like your hand is raised. I'm going to unmute you now. Miss Matt?
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. This is a question for Karen McGovern. I heard part of your explanation of what making this rule permanent really means. Can you explain that once more, please?
Hi, this is Karen. I think when you look at the Administrative Procedure Act, emergency rules can be in place for 120 days. That means that at the end of August, these rules will expire regardless of whether or not the pandemic exists, and regardless of whether or not new graduates are able to test for their license. In making these rules permanent, what will happen is that the rule will continue until such time as the basis for the rules expires. So I think it's really important, if you look up at the top of the rule where it talks about the board's authority to promulgate the rules, it is directly tied to the governor's executive order and the state of emergency order. At the time where the executive order and the state of emergency order end, the board no longer has authority for these rules, and therefore they will be repealed. We don't have an option to keep temporary rules in place or emergency rules in place longer than the 120 days. As the pandemic is ramping back up, our assumption is that it is going to last longer than August. And so we wanted to get rulemaking in place to see if that's something that we needed to do to continue this. The boards, it is their discretion. They can certainly say, no, we think that enough people have had their testing and we're going to go ahead and let these expire. Or they can make them permanent, in which case the rules would stay in effect as long as the basis for the rules is in effect. Does that make sense?
Yes, that's very helpful and I appreciate it. I will say that in the notification for this stakeholder process, you just presented a much more nuanced explanation, and it's very helpful. And I can imagine that we might have had different comments from a number of the groups here had that been understood. I think the Veterinary Association probably could have made more sophisticated comments if that had been the case. So I guess I would just make a comment in the future. It would be helpful to give us a little more context for the decision that's in front of us. I think we certainly assumed that you were asking about making this, a rule like all the other rules are in the veterinary rules. So that was not something we understood, but understanding now that it's conditioned upon the executive order and the state of emergency is very helpful. Personally, I can imagine that this state of emergency that we're in might last until a vaccine is developed. So, that could be quite some time. If that's the case, would this temporary emergency provision, would it continue that long if the state of emergency stayed in place and say till the spring of 2021?
Obviously, I can't speak for the board, but what I can tell you is when you look at these emergency rules, it talks about new graduates who are unable to test.
Right.
These new graduates have to work under the supervision of another veterinarian. I know that there could be those people that want to delay their examinations, but I also understand that most of the new graduates that I've been in contact with, who I've heard from, they're working very hard to get their license. They don't want a temporary license, and so they're just struggling with getting seats at testing centers. And so I'm assuming that once there is no longer a problem with testing, that the board will revisit the rule, since that is what the rule talks about. So okay. I guess my end point is even if the state of emergency continues, if we don't have a problem with testing, then there would be no reason for the temporary licenses.
I'm getting a little bit of feedback. Is somebody need to be muted? Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
I just have a comment from Crystalline Lowry, who says she agrees that the context given here was much more clear than everything given over the web. Doesn't appear there's any further comments at this time.
It looks like Ms. Matt's hand is raised again. Not quite sure. If
I've unmuted you, Diane. Did you want to speak further?
No, I was trying to lower my hand. I guess I didn't do it.
Okay.
Thank
I
you.
don't see any other hands raised. Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. So we will go ahead and conclude the stakeholder meeting. Thank you for participating in today's meeting. The stakeholder comments and program recommendations will be presented to the boards prior to the formal rulemaking hearings. We do have hearings that are tentatively scheduled, and I say tentative because they have not been noticed with the Secretary of State, but these dates are pretty firm within the division. So the hearing for the chiropractic examiners is planned for August 25th, 2020. The hearings for optometry and the physical therapy board are scheduled for August 14th, 2020. The podiatry board is scheduled for August 21st of 2020. And the hearing for veterinarian medicine is scheduled for August 20th. So we will be providing more specific and detailed information as we get closer to those dates. And as always, they'll be sent out via email to stakeholders and licensees. It'll be posted on the board's on each board's website and on their calendar as well. So you should definitely have plenty of notice. So that concludes our stakeholder meeting. And thank you again for your participation. We're going to go ahead and end the webinar now.